Let me get a little sip of water. We had the fire logs on this morning. It was a little bit dry maybe. This afternoon we're probably going to have to put the air conditioner on. It's that time of the year again. Spectacular. And it's easy at this time of the year. It's easy for us as we start to see the life returning to the trees and to the plants and to the yards that have been barren for the winter. Everything is starting to blossom anew. It's easy for us to understand the theme of the Easter season that we are in now. This theme of renewal, this theme of resurrection. You know, the symbol of a seed with a hard shell on its outside to protect it, or even a chick within an egg has the hard shell to protect it while it is growing, while it is getting ready to enter this world, is an easy one for us to understand. To see how the seed goes into the ground and it sits in the soil until the conditions are exactly right at a time of its choosing. Perhaps it's a chemical choosing, but at a time of its choosing when it knows that everything is the right temperature, the right humidity, the right moisture. Something from within causes that hard shell to crack. And the seed puts forth little shoots, little roots that reach out into that soil. And there they find the nutrition, the moisture, the food that is exactly perfect for that plant to grow. And it puts its little shoot up, and its nose up from down. And it puts its little shoot up and pushes through whatever may be above it until it breaks out into the sunlight and continues to grow. And it is transformed. It is no longer the seed, but it is the plant. And yet the plant was within the seed. And yet it is still as much of what it is as it was when it was in the seed form. A mighty oak tree is still an oak tree when it's an acorn. But as the seed has sprouted, it is born again. It is born anew. It is resurrected. And it comes into a new life. It comes into a new way of expressing. And that's what Easter is about. You can see the symbolism of the cave that was hewn from rock, and it had a stone rolled in front of it. It's like the hard shell that the seed is in. And the body of the crucified Jesus was placed into this cave. But when the time was right, something within that cave, something within that tomb caused him to come back, caused him to come forth, and to be born into a new life and into a new way of expressing. And this is what the symbolism of Easter is all about. And of course, it's not just about someone who lived a long time ago. It's about each and every one of us. That each and every one of us, periodically, we must renew our commitment to our growth. We must renew our commitment to our destiny, which is to grow into a different expression, a greater expression of the love and of the peace and of the joy that is the true nature of our soul, that is the true nature of our being, that is the true nature of that which has created us out of itself, excuse me. So we talked last week a bit about the metaphor of a garden as our soul, that the way that we would tend for our garden is the way that we must tend for our soul. We must carefully choose what we will put into our garden. We must create the conditions within the soil of our own soul, so that as these seeds are planted, they will find the right conditions in which to grow. And I just want to mention briefly the importance of the parables, the importance of the metaphors, the importance of the teaching stories. Now we have to remember that the teachers of long ago, Jesus, the Buddha, Aesop with his fables, that the teachers of long ago didn't have the tools and the techniques that we have today. The ability to write something down on a piece of paper and give it to millions of people. You know, we can go sit at our computer and type something on a blog on the internet and hit the send button, and it goes out to the whole world, or to everyone in the world who is on our distribution list, everyone who wants to see what we have to say. But years ago, of course, they didn't have this, and people were not necessarily literate. They couldn't read and write. So even if there was a way of writing something down onto, say, parchment, or to write it into clay tablets, the means of mass production weren't there. The means of making copies and Xerox machines and all of that were not there. So what the teachers did was they found a way to tell a story, a teaching story, a parable, that people would remember, that people would take that picture away with them, away from hearing it. They would have something to take with them, something that they were familiar with. So people were familiar with growing seeds. They were familiar with raising sheep and goats. And in the Middle East, by the way, sheep and goats were more like pets than we would consider them to be a domesticated farm animal here. The shepherds in the Middle East did not slaughter their animals for meat. They raised the lambs for wool. They raised the goats for milk. And they treated these animals like part of the family, like we would treat our dogs and our cats. They had names for them. And they treated them very friendly, very fondly, very lovingly. And this is why the image of the Good Shepherd is given to us. A good shepherd cares for its sheep. A good shepherd knows each one of its sheep. So the people who are familiar with that would get this image of this good shepherd who cared for its flock, and then they would relate that to this idea of God. So the teachers were given stories. They were giving stories to those who would come to hear them. Both the Buddha and Jesus and the teachers of the Upanishads in India, they would teach to large crowds, and they would stand on hillsides so that the people could see them. You know, you could imagine a teacher up high on the hill, and the audience sitting down lower and lower on the hill, or vice versa, either way. But everybody would have a line of sight to the teacher, and that's the Upanishads literally means teaching received at the feet of the master, sitting at the feet of the master. So Jesus, in order to be seen by the crowds, at time would be on the hillside. And in this example that we're going to relate to today, he was on the shore of the lake, which of course usually is pretty flat, and the crowd trying to get in closer and closer to him. So what he did was he went and he got into the boat, and he pushed offshore just a little bit so the people wouldn't wade out and get too close to him. And then everybody could see him, and he could begin to give a story that people would relate to, a story that people would remember, a story that they could take away. And even though they may not be able to read nor write, they were able to take the story with them, and they were able to give it time, to give it attention, to move from hearing it to understanding it and realizing it. Oh, but that's about me. That's about my growth. That's about my soul. And then to move to the next step, which is to live it, which is to internalize it, just to be the message, the three levels that we talk about. So in this particular example, we're talking about is the sower of the seeds. And in some places they call it the soils, the sower of the soils, which is exactly what we're talking about today, is preparing the soil. As we wish to allow the seeds of love and of peace and of joy and of prosperity, of loving kindness, of selfless service, all the things, whatever it is that we wish to express this year, how we wish to grow, the seeds that we selected from the catalog last week. If we wish them to grow, we must put them in soil that has been prepared. So in this parable, which is a very famous parable, I'm sure everybody, excuse me, most everybody has heard it in one way or shape or form, is that there was a sower of seeds. And the sower of seeds was going around and scattering seeds. And some of the seeds fell on a path where the ground is damped down hard. They couldn't take root. They couldn't grab hold. And the birds of the air came and scooped them up, ate them up. And if you've ever gone out and tried to sow grass seed on your lawn, you know what I'm talking about. As soon as you go out and sow the seed on your lawn, no matter how much you try to cover it with straw or peat moss, the birds know exactly what's going on, and they get in there and they start eating the seed as fast as they can. I wonder sometimes if we're feeding the lawn or if we're feeding the birds. But of course the seeds couldn't grow, they were gone. Other seeds, they fell on soil that was rocky soil. It wasn't very good soil, it was very shallow soil. And the seeds, because they were so close to the surface, they hadn't been planted down deep enough, they grew very quickly. They sprouted and they grew very quickly. They were warm. But they didn't have a good foundation. They didn't have a good root system. They couldn't reach out far into the soil to get the nourishment that they needed to grow. And as soon as the conditions changed, as soon as a drought came or something of that nature, why, they withered up and they died. They just didn't have the necessary support system. And then there were seeds that were cast among the thorns. They were cast into the thickets and the bramble. And if you've ever had a piece of land that's kind of wet and swampy, you know exactly what I'm talking about. We had a spot in Hickory, North Carolina that the kudzu and the honeysuckle would try to strangle each other at night, and the noise would keep you awake. There was so much activity out there. But that's about all that was growing, was the thorns and the weeds. And the seed falls in amongst them, and the seed tries to sprout, but it can't grow. It can't get sunlight. It can't get nutrition. It is just crowded out by the weeds. And then finally the seeds fell into the good soil, where they took root, where they were properly nourished, where they could grow and they could sprout, and they could reproduce. They could return. The parable tells us over 100-fold they returned back. So you can imagine a kernel of corn returning 100 kernels of corn, and you can just see this lush. You can get this idea of this lush garden. And in the New Testament, the disciples. Now remember, everything here is a teaching story. Everything that is in here is a teaching story, and some of it, as I read through this, I'm sure some of it was written in after the fact, maybe several hundred years after the fact, and was starting to put forward the propaganda, if you will, of the early church, kind of putting forward their views or putting their words into the mouth of Jesus. Now, just a brief aside is that when the teachers would teach in this form, in the form of the parable, they would use a zippy language, so to speak, alliteration and rhymes and things that people could easily remember, and they would take away. And of course, Jesus was probably teaching in Aramaic. So the scholars today, when they go back and they look at the Bible and they want to see if this is something that Jesus might have actually said, they look for that style, that language style. And if it's not there, then they assume that this is something that was added later by someone who didn't speak the original language. You know, perhaps somebody writing in Greek or somebody writing in Latin who was trying to editorialize, trying to put things in there. But if you go and you look at this teaching story, what happens is the disciples are going to Jesus and they're saying, well, why do you teach in parables? And what is the meaning of this parable? And Jesus is saying, well, people have ears, but they do not hear. They have eyes, but they do not see. And in Aramaic, that meant that you have to internalize. You have to not take things intellectually. You have to hear them, but then you have to understand them. You have to go within and you have to start to understand what that means to you. And then Jesus went on to explain the parable. And of course, he's explaining it not for the disciples, but explaining it for everybody who would come later and read the story so they would understand what was meant. And of course, the path is where we're hardened. We have so much coming in that we start to tune out what's going on in the world around us. We put our shell on. We have our protective barrier, and we don't let things in so easily. And if we hear the seeds of truth, if we hear the ideas of love and the ideas of peace, and we take them in, but we haven't really prepared a soft place in our heart for these to land. We hear them and they kind of bounce right off. They fall right off. I think it was Welcome Back, Kotter, Gabe Kaplan, and talk about how the ideas would just kind of go floating across from the teacher. They would go floating across the classroom, and just you could hear them hit the students on the forehead and just plop on the floor. But they didn't go in. They didn't sink in anywhere. And this is the hard soil. This is the part of us where we are so busy, we are so involved in our day-to-day activity, we have so much information coming in that we have put up a barrier to anything new coming in, and the ideas hit us, but they don't seek in. Excuse me. And then the rocky soil, the shallow soil, that's probably one that we can all relate to in our personal lives and around us and in witnessing around us. This is kind of, people hear something, they hear the good news, they hear the good ideas, they hear the words of inspiration and get all excited and enthusiastic, and they're just absolutely, yes, this is so wonderful. I've never heard anything as wonderful as this teaching before, and all of these kinds of ideas, they get very, very excited, and there's this big I guess spurt of growth, you would call it, this big, very enthusiastic spurt of growth. But that's all there is to it, and it withers and it dies. As soon as something happens to challenge the new belief system, people go back to the old way of believing. We saw this a lot in change management in corporate America. We would talk about a new and different way of thinking and being and running the business, and everybody would say, oh yes, this is wonderful, this is exactly the kind of stuff we ought to be doing to prepare for the future. But boy, as soon as one quarter of bad results came in, we would go right back to our old way of thinking and our old way of believing and our old way of acting. And even though it was wrong, and even though everybody knew it was wrong, that's exactly what people would do because they were comfortable with it. To illustrate that in corporate America, when we were talking about change, we would say when the Titanic hit the iceberg, some people went back to their cabins and waited for further instructions, and they're still waiting there. Now, of course, I don't know if that's true or not, but that was a teaching story that we used in corporate America. So the point is that sometimes we get excited about our growth. Sometimes we want to sow the new seeds. Sometimes we want to experience to a greater degree God's love and God's peace, God's joy, God's prosperity. We want all the goodness of God in our lives. We get excited about it. We get enthusiastic about it, but we haven't prepared our soil well enough. And we have this spurt of growth, and then either we lose our enthusiasm or something happens to challenge our beliefs, and the new way of thinking and the new way of believing and the new way of acting just dies off, and we go right back to being the way that we were. We all have busy lives, and some of the seeds get sown down in the thicket, in the thorns, in the thistle of all of the other things that we have going on in our minds. We are trying to entertain this idea of God's peace at the same time that we are listening to stories of war and horror and tragedy, and we have all of this conflict going on inside of our minds, and the idea of peace tries to come up. The truth of peace tries to get through this thicket, but we continue to indulge in the old ways of thinking. We continue to participate in the ain't it awful attitude of society, which is basically what we get in the media. They try to show us what's awful, so we go, oh my. They want us to be emotionally reactive to what's going on. So they show us things deliberately to push our emotional buttons. And we get caught up in that drama, we get addicted to that drama, and we have this seed that we've tried to sow, the seed of love, the seed of peace, the seed of hope. And what happens is it gets strangled out by the day-to-day activity of our lives. And then, of course, the good soil, the soil where we have taken time to prepare, we have taken time to make ourselves ready, for the growth that we want to embark upon this year, the growth that we want to experience, the growth that we have chosen when we have gone in and selected the seeds in our catalog. So this idea of the parable of the seeds and the soils and the sower, this idea is an idea that even those of us who grew up in an urban environment, we can relate to at some level. We can understand that. We can take this parable, this metaphor with us. We can take it in our heart, and as we go through life and we look at everything that's sprouting, we can get a little deeper. We can take a little bit further. So let's talk a little bit then about spiritual growth and how do we prepare the soil of our soul? How do we relate to all this and take it beyond words into activity, into something that we can actually do? So if you want to plant your garden, now hopefully you're not like me. Hopefully last year when the winter came, you went out and you prepared your garden for the winter. You kind of put a covering of mulch over your garden, and perhaps put a covering of ground cloth over it to keep things from growing up. But if you didn't, what you have to do is you have to go out and you have to clean the trash off of the garden. There are sticks and twigs and branches that have fallen onto the garden. There are leaves that have piled up on the garden. There may be, other debris, yard debris. There may be stones or pine cones, or if you have the kind of trees that I have, we have these little round, I think they call them sugar gum balls, which there are bazillions of them, and I don't know of any way to use them. They're just there, and they're indestructible. So the ground is all covered with these things, and the ground needs to be cleaned. We need to rake it off. We need to get the trash out of there. We need to get any vines that have started to grow. We need to get that all out of there. So the first thing we need to do is we need to clean our garden. And then the second thing that we need to do is once we get everything cleaned, we need to go in there and till it. We need to turn it over. We need to break up the sod. We need to turn it all down so that any of the organic matter that's on the surface gets turned under to a place where the worms and the insects can get to it, and they can start to break it down into nutrients that are small enough that whatever we plant in our garden is able to reach out and get a hold of. It has to be small enough that it can be absorbed by the roots. And once we turn over the soil, we have to break up the hard spots. We have to break up the clods. We have to get in there perhaps and do a little bit more than just tilling. We have to go out and stomp on the hard spots. We have to maybe take our hoe and break them up, or our rake or our shovel and break them up. And we have to pulverize them. We have to take those big clumps, those big hard places, and we have to make them soft. And then the last thing we might do is we might put in our garden fertilizer, compost that we can till back under the compost. We can fill the garden with rich black soil so that As the seeds start to grow, they have more nutrition. The compost will keep the soil from clumping back up again. Here we have clay, and it likes to come together and start to form bricks in the summertime. It gets wet, and then the sun shines on it, and it turns hard. But if you put enough compost in there, if you put enough natural organic material in there, peat moss, those sorts of things, what happens is the soil stays soft and it stays pliable. And it's easier for the plants to get their roots in there. So we said, well, how do we do that with our soul? You know, our soul is our consciousness mostly below the level of what we are aware. Our soul is our subconscious, we might call it in psychology. So how do we do this? How do we go in and how do we prepare the soul? How do we prepare the soil of our soul? And this is where our spiritual practice comes in. Excuse me, this is what our spiritual practice is for. You know, I think a lot of times we think that spiritual practice is just simply for the purpose of sowing a new seed and then moving on. But it takes more work than that. It takes more commitment than that. There's more to realizing the presence of God than getting up in the morning and saying to yourself, today I realize the presence of the God within all persons, and then going about doing everything exactly the same way we did it yesterday. It's insanity. Insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. It takes commitment. It takes time. It takes a thirsting desire to be the best gardener of your soul that you can possibly be. Do you really want to do this? Do you really want to have a garden in your soul? Do you really want to nurture the love and the peace and the presence of God? Or do you just want to go on with life as it has been? It's a choice that we must make. It's a choice that we are required to make. Now, ultimately, we're all going to choose to grow our soul, each and every one of us, at some point. For those who are listening, those who are on the bridge or who are listening on the internet, I believe that we have made that choice. I believe that's why we're here. But each and every one of us, each and every soul eventually awakens to the true purpose of life and decides to become a good gardener, a good steward of the soil, a good nurturer of our own growth. So the first thing we want to consider is meditation. Excuse me. And what I mean by meditation here is just sitting and being still. Now, there are many different forms of meditation, many different techniques in meditation. But what I'm talking about here is simply being quiet, simply being still. Nature is a good place to do this. Sitting and just closing our eyes, or mostly closing our eyes and counting from 1 to 5 over and over again, is a wonderful technique. And it's wonderful for this reason, because as we try to be still, those things, the trash in our mind, the sticks, the stones, the ideas that keep popping up, the selfish ideas, the spiteful ideas, the critical ideas, all of the ideas, the judgmental ideas, all of these things become very, very visible to us, very, very visible to our consciousness. So we're trying to be still, we're trying to be quiet, and an idea pops up. And we observe the fact that the idea pops up, but we also become aware of what kind of idea it is. Is it a kind and loving idea? Is it a critical idea, a judgmental idea? Is it an idea that we even want to have or need to have? Maybe it's just a distraction. Maybe it's something that's totally unimportant. But the fact that it's unimportant and it came up while we were trying to meditate is important. What is there within us that wants to distract us from our growth? What is there within us that is afraid of what the garden might produce? So taking time to meditate, taking time to become aware of our thoughts and not become entangled with them. Not to not to say, oh my goodness, where did that idea come from? Why do I have that idea? Who gave me that idea? All of those things. That's not the purpose. The purpose is to just observe it and to let it go. Not to give it any more energy than it already has, just to let it go. In Buddhism, one of the teaching stories that is used to illustrate this is about a man who is shot. They're in a battle, and he is shot with a poison arrow. And his companions take him off the battlefield, and they're going to cut the arrow out. And the man says, now wait a minute, before you cut the arrow out, he says, do you know who shot me? Have you figured out yet who it was that shot me? We need to know who shot me before we cut the arrow out. And they say, no, it's not important who shot you. We need to get the poison out. That's what we need to do. And he says, well, before you do that, he says, look at this wood. He says, excuse me, I've never seen an arrow made of wood quite like this. Where do you suppose these kind of trees grow? And they tell him it's not important what kind of wood is used for the shaft of the arrow. What's important is we need to get the poison out. And he says, well, now wait a second. He says, look at the feathers on here. He says, I've never seen feathers like these feathers. What kind of feathers do you suppose these are? What kind of bird do you think these came from? And he says, not important what kind of bird it came from. We need to get the poison out. And he goes on and on. He looks at the stripes on the arrow and what kind of paint and all these kinds of things. So we do this with our ideas. We do this when we start to learn to observe our own thought. We see these thoughts and we become entangled with them. Who put the thought there? What kind of thought is it? Where did it come from? All of those things. And it's not the point. It's not the point of the exercise. The point is to let it go. Let's get the poison out. Let's let it go. So we learn to meditate, and in learning to meditate, our mind does get quieter. In learning to meditate, we become more aware of what's in there. We become more guardful of what's in there. We recognize if there are thorns and thickets in there. We recognize if there are lots of negative ideas crawling around in there, and we can just let them go simply by not feeding them anymore, simply by not inviting them into our consciousness anymore. Excuse me. As we learn to meditate, we do in fact become more aware of what we are being aware of during the day. What is it we're giving our time and our attention to during the day? Are we caught up into the drama of the world? Are we caught up into the headlines of the day? Are we caught up with the chatter of our own mind, which is just another form of drama that's crossing our paths of visibility? Or are we centered in our growth? Are we focused on the seeds that we have chosen to plant? Are we committed to preparing our soil? So meditation is a good way to start to prepare the soil. Treatment, spiritual mind treatment, is the equivalent of plowing things up. Excuse me, of using a force to turn under what's already there, to initiate the change, to truly begin to start a new experience, to start something anew happening in our life, in our experience. So we have to recognize that when we do our treatment, that what we are doing is we are invoking a power that knows what to do, to shake loose, to turn over, to begin whatever needs to be done for this new idea to take root and to grow within us. So we need to use our practice of spiritual mind treatment on a regular basis, not just once in a while. On a regular basis, we need to stop and we need to remind ourselves, and it could be as quickly as saying, there's only one life, and that life is love, and that love is growing through me right here and right now, and anything unlike love In my consciousness, in all consciousness, dissolves into the nothingness from which it came. And so it is. And that's a 30-second treatment, and you can do that during the day. You can do that as you're driving your car. You can do that wherever you are. But you can continually go in there and use that power to turn over the old soil, to break up the old ideas, to get something new going and started. You can use also affirmations, which are very good for breaking up the clods. So we all have these little spots. Excuse me here. We all have these little spots in our consciousness that it's maybe tough for us to let go of an old idea. But we can use affirmations, which are a statement of the truth that we know we may not entirely accept right now, but it is a statement nevertheless of the truth. And we say our affirmation and we repeat it over and over. And what that does is like a little shock wave, if you will, to that clod in our subconscious. It goes in there and it hammers it away and it breaks it up. And at first, as we start doing this, that clod starts to resist. It doesn't want to go. But as we continue to use our affirmation, for example, the love of God is all there is. I am God's living expression of love. That might be an example of an affirmation. As we do that, then what happens is that anything within us that doesn't yet believe that truth, the truth that we stated, I am the love of God in expression right here and right now, anything within us that doesn't agree with that, it starts to get shaken up. It starts to loosen. It starts to dissolve into the nothingness from which it came. So when we start with the affirmation, maybe the first day or the first week or the first month, depending upon how long the clod has been there and how stubborn it is, it may put up a resistance. And in fact, we may feel uncomfortable. Sometimes we start to do our spiritual practice and we feel uncomfortable. But eventually that clod will give way. Eventually that clod will dissolve. And whatever we were clinging on to, the false idea that we were clinging on to, will be gone. And then we will start to resonate with that. Yes, I am the love of God in action. I am God's living instrument of peace, and it will be comfortable for us, and we can go on. And we want to nurture. We want to put our fertilizer and our compost in the soil. We don't want to stop doing that. So we continue to feed ourselves with inspirational material. We continue to turn off the things that don't support our growth, to tune out the things that don't support our growth. And we want to take time on a daily basis to read something nurturing, to find our favorite author, our favorite teacher, to listen to a talk, to read a paragraph, to just simply nurture our soul. Who is it that inspires you? What authors inspire you? Who are your favorite ones? I mean, the internet's wonderful. You can find almost anything out there if you start to search for your teachers. Go to the Upanishads, go to the Old Testament, go to the New Testament. Find something that speaks to your soul and till it in there. Till it in there. Turn it under. So as we prepare our soil for the seeds that we selected last week, we know that what we are doing is we are participating in a greater expression of God's love, a greater expression of God's peace, and a greater expression of God's joy. And we have prepared a good bed, a good seed bed for these ideas to come in. So next week we're going to talk about planting and weeding and feeding. We're going to talk a little bit more about this metaphor of the soul as a garden. But for this week, I invite you to consider, what are you prepared to do? What are you prepared to do to prepare your soul for the growth that you want to experience this year? We have been blessed with this opportunity to awaken today. I don't know if you saw the thing I put on Facebook from the Dalai Lama. says, I'm grateful that I have awoken today. I have precious human life. I will not waste it. We have all awoken today. We have precious human life. We have the opportunity to consciously choose how we would like to know God more fully this year. And we have the ability to do all of the things that I just mentioned to prepare our soul. But we must do it. We must take the time and we must do it. We must set aside the time that we will do it. It must be a top priority in our life, not something that we get to after we've completed everything else in our day, but something that we do first, something that we do continuously, something that we do before we close our eyes at night. There's nothing more important, I would suggest, there's nothing more important to any of us than discovering the presence of God within and sharing that with each other. But this year, I invite you to make it your top priority. Select your seeds carefully, as we discussed last week. Prepare your soul thoughtfully. And next week, we will talk about planting and weeding and feeding. How do you want to be born again this year? How do you want to renew your spiritual life this year? How do you want God's love to be made visible in this plane of existence as you this year? What are you going to plant in your spiritual garden? And are you going to prepare the soil? So there's not just a flash in the pan, it's not just a spurt of growth, and then as soon as the going gets tough, we wither and die. But that we are the good soil, where the seeds take root and return 100-fold the blessings that God has given to us, to the world. And so it is.